Hi, Plant ID students. Welcome to another week of class. I know that we are getting close to a big break and we are getting close to the end of the semester in general. So keep working hard. We are almost there. And hopefully we can all end the semester on a positive note. In this week's video, I am going to be continuing our discussion of biomes. And I'm giving this lecture because I am a huge grasslands nerd. I could talk about them for hours. Luckily for you, I'm not going to talk about them for hours. Let's try and keep this video short, so I'll get into it. As the name suggests, grasslands are dominated by grasses, but you shouldn't underestimate just how many flowering species can be found within them. Typically, you'll have a few very common and dominant grass species, and then scattered throughout, you'll have multitudes of flowering species. Now, I think that sometimes the humble grassland can get overshadowed by other biomes, but I'm going to try and convince you that they are cool, that they are worth preserving, and have a lot of unique beauty and value that cannot really be found elsewhere in the world. Some of that beauty comes from unique biological or cultural heritage. On the left, I have a picture of an extraordinarily rare orchid species that can really only be found in some Northern American grasslands. And then there are plenty of cultures around the world who call grasslands home. And of course, many American cultures that utilize grasslands have been more or less obliterated, but there are still some native cultures, especially in Asia, that are using the grasslands in the way that ancestors were thousands of years ago. Under climate change, grasslands are also going to be very important. I think a lot of folks, when they think about taking atmospheric carbon and sequestering it away into the ground, they think of forests, which is okay, they do that. But grasses also do a great job of this. If you look at the photo I have, upper left here, this is just an example of how much biomass grasses and other grassland plants produce that you don't see. It's all underground, these very extensive root networks. But those root networks really help to sequester atmospheric carbon and return it to the earth. Also, if grasslands are undisturbed, left alone, or just very well managed, they can actually be very stable under global change. With so much change, stability is really what we need. Stability is what we can count on. So it's a great quality for these grasslands to have. And I could go on and on, but some other services they provide. They increase the health of soils. Let's see, good grasslands improve water quality and provide pollination for many agricultural systems surrounding them. And I will say they are everywhere. They cover a substantial portion of almost every continent. And depending on what figure you look at, depending on what types of ecosystems these include, they can cover anywhere from 20 to 40% of the Earth's land surface. Now, in many ways, the figure I have displayed here on the screen is a little too simplistic, but I think it does a good job of demonstrating some of the different types of grasslands you might run into, which they delineate as savanna, prairie, and steppe. And I will go through those now. So a savanna ecosystem is defined as a grassland with scattered trees. And those scattered trees have to be scattered enough so that the canopy is still open. That allows for plenty of light to still reach the ground and the grassland plants below. I think when I say savanna, a lot of y'all will think of the African savanna, great example, but a little closer to home, there is something called the American oak savanna. And you can see that at the bottom of this screen. I'm from Michigan, and historically, a lot of Michigan resembled this type of system. Next are the prairies, and these are grasslands with much less woody cover. but they are still moist enough to allow for continuous cover of grasses. America in general is really known for our awesome prairies. We have the mixed grass in more of the central US and the Great Plains, and then the tall grass prairie in the eastern side of the Great Plains, which I'll go into a little bit more later. But the third type is probably the type that we are most familiar with, which is called steppe. It is grassland that is typically drier than the rest, so much so that the plant cover has to be kind of broken up. And that is what, of course, is around us in the Front Range. That is Front Range short grass steppe ecosystem. I love it. But another really amazing example besides the Front Range is the Inner Mongolian steppe, where there are quite literally hundreds of thousands of square miles of just beautiful alpine steppe. If you ever get the chance to go, take that opportunity. And I want to talk about some of the primary forces that shape grasslands. So the first is precipitation. Whether or not your grassland is going to be steppe, prairie, or savanna, it depends on precipitation. It's got to be low enough that you can still support, or well, I should say it's got to be high enough that you can still support these herbaceous plants. No, I was right the first time. Sorry, it's got to be low enough that you can support these plants, but not high enough that woody species begin to move in. Pardon. Second is fire. Fire is incredibly important. I'll get more into that later. And then the last are grazers. Grazers evolved with these ecosystems side by side, and they really encourage biodiversity. I'll go through these one at a time, so let's start with precipitation. So from this point on in my little talk here, I'm going to be focusing in on the Great Plains grasslands. One, because that's where the majority of my knowledge comes from, but two, I think this is the example that people can connect with the most. And so one of the reasons why our Great Plains are so diverse is because of the rain shadow that's created by the Rocky Mountains. This conversation can be a little bit more complex. I'll keep it simple by just saying that the air that comes over the Rocky Mountains is very, very dry. It's basically the reason that Fort Collins gets so little rainfall. But as weather systems move across the US, move to the east, that effect, that dryness begins to let up. And so as you go from like the Fort Collins region to say Michigan, the effect of that rain shadow has pretty much just let up completely. But it's the reason why in the Front Range, we have the shortgrass steppe ecosystem, which is the driest. And then as you travel east, you get the tall grass prairie system, which in the case of the US is going to be the wettest. And here is an example of that. The shortgrass prairie system. It's very low to the ground, a little dry most of the years. And then the tall grass prairie system here, it's beautiful. It looks like an ocean, the way that the wind moves through the grass. Again, if you haven't had a chance to visit that system, please go. It's spectacular. And now I want to look at some of the plants of these regions. So starting with the shortgrass steppe, we'll look at flowers first. There are two common species of cacti. We have the plains prickly pear, which is Opuntia polycantha at the top here. And then our barrel cactus species called Echinocereus viridiflora. I had no idea, I just used a scientific name, but apparently its common name is nylon hedgehog cactus, which is adorable. Some of the flowers that you might encounter on the shortgrass steppe, you've got Sphaerosia coccinea here. It is scarlet globe mallow. There we go. You've heard me mention it a few times before. I'm a fan. Below that, we have the prairie zinnia. And another common species you might find is this pea plant here, Soralia tenuiflora, also called a slim flower scurf pea. In terms of grasses, there are a few really, really common dominant ones, and that is blue grama here and buffalo grass. These are both Bouteloua species, blue grama being Bouteloua gracilis, and the buffalo grass being Bouteloua dactyloides. If you go to the shortgrass steppe, you're probably going to come across both of these. The Bouteloua gracilis has these really fun and unique, what we call like eyebrow or eyelash seed heads. And then dactyloides is very similar, but it's a little bit more squat in every direction. It's a little shorter, a little stouter. Even its seed heads are just a little squished, just a little compressed. But what you're seeing out there more commonly now is also cheatgrass or Bromus tinctorum, which is quite invasive. And then if you go across the plains to the tallgrass prairie ecosystem, you will again find a multitude of flowering species. I've selected some to mention here because I just see them all the time. So the first one I have here in the upper right is western ragweed, or Ambrosia philosacea. A lot of you probably know this one because it is a horrible allergen to a lot of people. And then below that, we have several species of goldenrod that can commonly be found in tallgrass prairies. This one is Solidago canadensis. And similarly, there are many species of milkweed also found in the tall grass, this one being common milkweed or Asclepias syriaca. Now, grasses, the ones I have pictured here are the two most dominant grasses you'll probably find. Here on the left is big blue stem, which is Andropogon gerardii. And then on the right is Sorghastrum nutans, or Indian grass. You will find these if you go to the tallgrass prairie. And it's called tallgrass for a reason. Both of these species can get way taller than me. I'm not the tallest woman out there, but still, they can dwarf most people. And with that, I'd like to talk about the second factor that really shapes grassland, and that is fire. I think that a lot of folks have a natural inclination to believe that fire is a bad thing, and that's not necessarily untrue depending on where you are. But in many ecosystems, fire is absolutely essential in maintaining ecosystem health. It's normal, it's natural, it's necessary. And so this burning of grassland ecosystems usually occurs towards the end of the season, once all the grasses and plants have died back. And so it's very, very dry, which means that its conditions are going to be ripe for natural wildfires. And in research settings, instead of letting wildfires naturally occur, usually they occur in increments, in set increments. So they're always planned. But this burning is so essential, one, because it helps recycle nutrients back from the plants into the soil, but also it pushes back woody growth, especially a lot of the wetter grasslands like the tallgrass prairie. They could potentially support a lot of trees and a lot of woody growth. But that doesn't happen because fires continually push that woody growth back. Grasses, flowering species there, they can adapt and survive under fire conditions. Woody plants, not so much. And so a lot of the plants have developed strategies to deal with, continuous fire. So prairie plants in general, as I was mentioning before, have a massive underground root network. And that helps them in many, many different ways in terms of fire. So first, if you have a large underground network, fire just is not really going to reach those roots and those underground storage structures. So they'll be protected from the fire as it takes out above ground biomass. But with all the nutrients available underground, that allows the plant to compensate for any fire pretty quickly. Also, there's something called rhizomes that are very common in the dominant grasses. Rhizomes allow for underground growth. And so the image I have here on the lower right, that is likely all one plant. It kind of looks like a few just all stuck together, but it's likely all one plant. And it's just connected underground by those rhizomes. And so again, that's another way to make sure that instead of growing above and being vulnerable to fire, you keep that growth underground. And then another cool feature of these grasses and other grassland plants, at the end of the season, when their seed has been set, they can pull nutrients from above ground biomass back into underground storage systems. So if a fire does come by, mess it all up, no love lost there. Now, the third and final force I want to talk about is grazing. So grazing by large mammals usually is a very important force that can help suppress very quick growing grasses and allow for the slower flowering species to be able to flourish. So usually how that happens, grazers, bison are the classic example here. They will chomp whatever is in front of them, and that will open up the canopy and allow for those slow-growing flowering species to be able to get an edge over those grasses. Basically, they promote biodiversity. Now, in the same way that grasses are adapted to burning, they're also adapted to grazing. And so the image I have at the top here, that shows some above ground growth that keeps the plant growth low to the ground. The lower to the ground you are, the less likely that you're going to be chomped. And so these stolons are almost like rhizomes, but they allow for these plants to shoot across the ground and create new growth that way. Rhizomes work here as well. Below ground growth that allows you to stay away from the mouth of a grazer. It's also a good strategy. But I'm sorry, I can't leave this lecture just fun and happy, because like a lot of other biomes across the world, the American Great Plains, grasslands in general, are under substantial threat at the moment. In steppe ecosystems, we're seeing a lot of desertification, aka grasslands becoming much more like deserts, losing a lot of above ground production. And the reason why this is usually multiple factors combine, but it's often due to overgrazing by cattle, and droughts are increasing in frequency and severity, and those don't help either. Overgrazing, droughts might combine in effect to just cause too much biomass to be lost. And once you lose that biomass, it becomes very difficult to basically grow across that bare ground again, because that is when evaporation really gets a little bit out of control. And so you have more evaporation when you have bare ground, and more evaporation means less water for those plants to utilize. And then in prairies worldwide, we are seeing woody encroachment. So woody species coming in and just kind of taking over, which limits the diversity. And there are many reasons for this. One being that fires just aren't as common anymore. We have a tendency to suppress them. And also, woody species like elevated CO2. So the conditions that we are creating are just very good for them. And what's concerning about these two examples, both desertification and woody encroachment, is that they are incredibly difficult to reverse. So that doesn't bode well for the grasslands. And one of the reasons why this is happening just in general is because we have lost our primary grazers, bison herds used to stretch from coast to coast almost, as you can see from this historic map of their range. And I think we all know what happened to the bison herds, but if you haven't seen this photo before, that is literally a mountain of bison skulls. So we are unlikely to see them in the same range that they were in. But not all is lost. There is still some hope. We don't see bison on the landscape anymore. But what we do see on the landscape very commonly is a close cousin of theirs. Cattle can actually work as relatively good substitutes for bison if their herds are managed well. They can graze, they can help out the ecosystem, keep it diverse, but they cannot overgraze. And so, of course, it's helpful to have subsidies to make sure that grassland grazing, effective and well-managed grazing, is actually, practical for the farmers. But burning can also push back that woody encroachment. It's not easy, but it can be done. So luckily, grasslands are hopefully going to be here to stick around for the long term. If you hadn't already had an appreciation for grasslands, I hope that I have changed your mind. And next time you are in a grassland, I suggest going for a little frolic. Enjoy the biodiversity around you. I think that they're just such a cool ecosystem. The fact that once you're in them, you can see for miles around you. It makes the sky and the ecosystem just feel so grand. If you'd like to talk about ecosystems, any of them, especially grasslands, let me know. I'm happy to discuss any questions you have, because like I said, I'm a big grasslands nerd, and I'll talk about it for as long as you let me. Hopefully this video won't be too long, because boy howdy, I can talk about them. I'll see y'all later.